Picture this. It's supposed to be the happiest day of your life. You're standing at the altar, surrounded by everyone you love, about to marry the person of your dreams. The music is playing, the flowers are perfect. And then, in one single moment, everything shatters. A gunshot echoes through the chapel, screams pierce the air, and the bride watches in horror as her groom collapses to the ground. But here's what nobody expected. The woman holding the gun wasn't a stranger. She was someone he thought he'd left behind forever. Someone he'd destroyed. Someone who'd been silent for far too long. This is the story of Aaliyah Johnson, a 26-year-old woman from Atlanta, Georgia, who walked into a church on a sunny Saturday afternoon in June 2019 and changed dozens of lives forever. But to understand why she pulled that trigger, we need to go back. Back to where it all started. Back to the moment she met Andre Matthews, the man who would become both the love of her life and the architect of her destruction. This isn't just a story about a crime. It's about what happens when pain becomes unbearable, when the system fails to protect you, when justice feels like a word that doesn't apply to your suffering. It's about the invisible scars that people carry, the ones that don't show up in photographs or police reports. And it's about a decision that took seconds to make, but years to build toward. Aaliyah met Andre in the fall of 2014 at a community college in Atlanta where they were both taking business classes. She was 21, working 2 jobs to pay her tuition, living in a small apartment she shared with her cousin Renee. Andre was 23, charismatic, the kind of guy who could walk into any room and immediately become the center of attention. He had this smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the world. Aaliyah's friends remember the first time she talked about him. She was glowing. She said he was different from other guys she'd dated, that he actually listened to her, that he had ambitions and dreams just like she did. For the first few months, everything seemed perfect. Andre would show up at her job with flowers. He'd text her good morning every single day. He told her she was beautiful, that he wanted to build a future with her, that together they could accomplish anything. Aaliyah had grown up in foster care, bouncing between homes until she aged out of the system at 18. She'd never had stability, never had someone who made her feel truly wanted. So when Andre came into her life offering love and partnership, she held on tight, maybe too tight. Her cousin Renee was skeptical from the start. She said there was something about Andre that didn't sit right with her. Something in the way he would show up unannounced, or how he always needed to know where Aaliyah was and who she was with. But Aaliyah brushed off her concerns. She thought Renee was just being overprotective. She thought what she and Andre had was special. By the summer of 2015, they'd moved in together into a 1-bedroom apartment in College Park. Aaliyah had dropped down to 1 job to focus more on school, and Andre had started working as a manager at a car dealership. On the surface, they looked like any other young couple trying to make it work. They posted photos together on social media, went to parties with friends, talked about getting married someday. But behind closed doors, things were already starting to change. Andre had started making comments about Aaliyah's appearance, little digs disguised as jokes. He'd tell her she was gaining weight, that she should dress differently, that her friends were a bad influence. At first, Aaliyah tried to laugh it off, but the comments became more frequent, more cutting. Then came the accusations. Andre would go through her phone while she was sleeping, demanding to know who she'd been texting. He'd accuse her of flirting with other men, of cheating, of disrespecting him. Aaliyah would deny it, try to reassure him, but nothing she said seemed to be enough. The arguments started small, but escalated quickly. He'd yell, she'd cry, he'd apologize and promise to do better. And for a few days or weeks, things would seem okay again, until they weren't. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let's continue with what happened next, because this is where things take a darker turn. The first time Andre put his hands on Aaliyah was in November 2015. They'd been arguing about money. Aaliyah had gotten paid and wanted to use some of her paycheck to buy groceries and send a little money to Renee, who was struggling with rent. Andre said she was being selfish, that they had their own bills to worry about, that she always put everyone else before him. The argument escalated. Aaliyah tried to walk away, to go into the bedroom and cool off, but Andre grabbed her by the arm and yanked her back. He shoved her against the wall. The impact knocked the wind out of her. She remembers the look in his eyes, wild and unfamiliar, like he was someone else entirely. He didn't apologize right away this time. He stood there, breathing hard, staring at her, and then he turned and walked out of the apartment. Aaliyah sat on the floor for what felt like hours, trying to process what had just happened. When Andre came back later that night, he broke down crying. He said he didn't know what came over him, that he'd never do it again, that the stress of work was getting to him. He begged her to forgive him. And she did, because she loved him, because she believed people could change, because she thought if she just tried harder, if she was more understanding, things would get better. But they didn't get better. They got worse. The physical abuse became a pattern. It would happen every few weeks, then every few days. Sometimes a shove, sometimes a slap, sometimes worse. Andre would punch holes in the walls when he was angry, throw things, break her belongings. Aaliyah started walking on eggshells, trying to anticipate his moods, trying to avoid setting him off. She stopped seeing her friends as much because Andre didn't like them. She stopped posting on social media because Andre said it made her look attention-seeking. She became smaller and smaller, shrinking herself to fit into the box he'd built for her. Renee noticed the changes. She'd call Aaliyah and ask if everything was okay, and Aaliyah would lie. She'd say she was just busy with school and work, that everything was fine. But Renee wasn't stupid. She could hear the strain in Aaliyah's voice, the way she'd go quiet whenever Renee asked about Andre. One time, Renee showed up unannounced at their apartment and saw a bruise on Aaliyah's wrist. When she asked about it, Aaliyah said she'd bumped into a door. Renee begged her to leave Andre, to come stay with her, but Aaliyah refused. She said Renee didn't understand, that Andre was going through a hard time, that he loved her and was trying to get better. In March 2016, Aaliyah found out she was pregnant. She was terrified to tell Andre. Part of her worried about how he'd react, but another part hoped that maybe this would be the thing that changed him, that the idea of becoming a father would make him want to be better. When she finally told him, his reaction was mixed. At first, he seemed excited. He talked about baby names and what kind of father he wanted to be. But then the reality of it seemed to sink in and his mood shifted. He started saying they couldn't afford a baby, that Aaliyah would have to quit school, that this was going to ruin everything they'd been working toward. Aaliyah assured him they'd figure it out, that she'd keep working as long as she could, that they'd make it work together. For a few weeks, there was a fragile peace between them. Andre seemed calmer, more present. Aaliyah allowed herself to hope. She started looking at baby clothes online, imagining what their life might look like as a family. She was 12 weeks along when everything fell apart. It was a Friday night in late April. Andre came home from work in a bad mood. He'd been passed over for a promotion he'd been expecting, and he was furious. Aaliyah tried to comfort him, but he pushed her away. He started drinking, something he'd been doing more and more frequently. As the night went on, he became more agitated. He started accusing Aaliyah of getting pregnant on purpose to trap him, saying she was trying to ruin his life. Aaliyah tried to calm him down, tried to reason with him, but he wasn't listening. He grabbed her phone and started going through it, looking for evidence of infidelity that didn't exist. When he didn't find anything, he became even angrier. He accused her of deleting messages, of hiding things from him. Then he threw her phone across the room and it shattered against the wall. Aaliyah started crying, begging him to stop, to please just calm down and go to bed. That's when he hit her. Not a slap this time, but a closed fist to the side of her head. She stumbled backward, trying to protect herself, but he kept coming. He grabbed her by the shoulders and slammed her against the kitchen counter. She felt a sharp pain in her abdomen and cried out. He didn't stop. He shoved her to the ground and kicked her twice in the stomach before finally walking away. Aaliyah lay on the kitchen floor for a long time after he left, curled up in a ball, pain radiating through her body. She knew something was wrong. She could feel it. When she finally managed to get up and make it to the bathroom, she saw the blood. She called Renee, her voice shaking, barely able to get the words out. Renee rushed over and found Aaliyah sitting on the bathroom floor, pale and trembling. She took her straight to the emergency room. The doctors confirmed what Aaliyah already knew. She'd lost the baby. The trauma from the assault had caused a miscarriage. Aaliyah was admitted overnight for observation, and the hospital staff asked her questions about what happened. She lied. She said she'd fallen down the stairs. She was too scared, too ashamed, too broken to tell the truth. Renee begged her to file a police report, to leave Andre and never look back, but Aaliyah refused. She was grieving, in shock, unable to process the magnitude of what had happened. When Andre showed up at the hospital the next morning, he had flowers and tears in his eyes. He said he didn't remember what he'd done, that he'd blacked out from drinking. He said he was sorry, that he'd get help, that he'd never touch alcohol again. And once again, Aaliyah forgave him. Not because she believed him, but because she didn't know what else to do. The months that followed were the darkest of Aaliyah's life. She fell into a deep depression, barely eating, barely sleeping. She withdrew from school and eventually lost both of her jobs because she couldn't function. Andre, meanwhile, became more controlling than ever. He monitored her every move, took control of her finances, isolated her from anyone who might help her. Aaliyah felt like she was disappearing, like the person she used to be was slipping away, and all that was left was this hollow shell. In August 2016, things reached a breaking point. Aaliyah had managed to save a small amount of money, just over $2,000, that she'd hidden in a shoebox in the back of the closet. It was her emergency fund, the thing she'd told herself she'd use if she ever found the courage to leave. One day, she came home from a rare outing to the grocery store and found the shoebox empty. Andre was gone. His clothes were gone, his belongings were gone, and so was every cent she'd saved. He left a note on the kitchen counter. It was short and cruel. It said he couldn't do this anymore, that she was too much to deal with, that he needed to move on with his life. He didn't mention the money. He didn't apologize. He just left. Aaliyah stood in that empty apartment, holding that note, and something inside her shattered completely. She'd lost her baby because of him. She'd lost her sense of self, her friends, her education, her jobs. And now he'd taken the one thing she had left and walked away like she was nothing. She called the police to report the theft, but when they arrived and heard the full story, they told her it would be difficult to prove. They lived together. The money wasn't in a bank account. There was no paper trail. They suggested she could try to take him to small claims court, but they couldn't guarantee any outcome. Aaliyah filed a report anyway, knowing it probably wouldn't lead anywhere. She also tried to file a restraining order, hoping to at least keep Andre away from her. But without recent evidence of physical abuse or direct threats, her request was denied. The system had failed her at every turn. Aaliyah moved back in with Renee, who welcomed her with open arms and no judgment. For the next year, Aaliyah tried to rebuild her life. She went to therapy. She got a new job. She tried to move forward. But the trauma never really left her. She had nightmares about Andre, about the baby she'd lost, about the night he'd beaten her so badly she'd ended up in the hospital. She tried dating a few times, but every time a man showed even the slightest hint of possessiveness or anger, she'd shut down completely. Andre had broken something fundamental inside her, and she didn't know if it could ever be fixed. Then, in May 2019, 3 years after Andre had left, Aaliyah was scrolling through social media when she saw something that made her blood run cold. It was an engagement announcement. Andre Matthews and his fiancée, a woman named Keisha, smiling and happy, with a caption about starting there forever. Aaliyah's hands shook as she clicked through the photos. There was Andre, the same charming smile, the same eyes that had once looked at her with love before they'd filled with rage. And there was this woman, Keisha, looking at him like he'd hung the moon. Aaliyah felt sick. Did this woman know what Andre was capable of? Did she know what he'd done? Or was he playing the same game with her that he'd played with Aaliyah at the beginning, making her feel special and loved before the mask came off? Aaliyah spent the next few weeks obsessively checking their social media accounts. She saw the wedding date, June 15, 2019. She saw the venue, a beautiful church in Buckhead. She saw the photos of the bridal shower, the bachelor party, the countdown posts. And with every post, something inside her twisted tighter and tighter. She thought about reaching out to Keisha, warning her, telling her everything. But what would she say? Would this woman even believe her? Or would Andre have already poisoned her against any ex-girlfriends, painting himself as the victim of crazy women who couldn't let him go? Aaliyah knew how convincing he could be, how easily he could twist the truth. The night before the wedding, Aaliyah couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with memories she'd tried so hard to bury. She thought about the baby she'd lost, the future that had been stolen from her. She thought about the money Andre had taken, the years of abuse, the way he'd discarded her like she was garbage when he was done. She thought about how he was about to stand in front of God and everyone and promise to love and cherish this woman, the same promises he'd made to Aaliyah before he'd destroyed her. And she thought about how he would probably do the same thing to Keisha eventually, how the cycle would repeat, how another woman would end up broken and traumatized while Andre moved on to the next victim. Something inside Aaliyah snapped, not all at once, but like a crack in glass that slowly spreads until the whole thing shatters. She'd spent 3 years trying to heal, trying to move on, trying to be okay. But how could she be okay when the man who'd ruined her life was out there living his best life, getting married, probably telling people he was a changed man? How could there be any justice in that? At 3 in the morning, Aaliyah got out of bed and went to the closet. In the back, behind boxes of old clothes and shoes, was a lockbox. Inside was a handgun that Renee had bought her a year ago for protection. Aaliyah had never even loaded it before. She'd hoped she'd never need it, but as she sat there on her bedroom floor holding that gun, she felt a strange sense of clarity. She wasn't thinking about consequences or what would happen afterward. She was thinking about that baby, her baby, who never got a chance to live because of what Andre had done. She was thinking about every bruise, every insult, every time he'd made her feel worthless. She was thinking about 3 years of therapy and nightmares and struggling to trust anyone. And she was thinking about Keisha, standing at that altar with no idea what she was marrying into. Aaliyah loaded the gun. She put it in her purse, and she decided that Andre Matthews was going to pay for what he'd done. The next morning, June 15th, Aaliyah woke up and got dressed like she was going to a funeral. She put on a simple black dress, pulled her hair back, and looked at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back at her looked tired, hollow, like someone who'd already died inside. Renee had left early for work, so Aaliyah was alone in the apartment. She wrote a note and left it on the kitchen table, just in case. In it, she tried to explain everything: the abuse, the baby, the money, the years of suffering. She didn't know if anyone would understand, but she needed to try. Then she picked up her purse, got in her car, and drove to Buckhead. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. Aaliyah arrived at the church around 1:30. The parking lot was filling up with guests, people in their wedding finest, laughing and chatting as they headed inside. Aaliyah parked at the far end of the lot and sat in her car, watching. She saw Andre arrive in a black SUV with his groomsmen, all of them in matching suits, joking around and clapping him on the back. He looked happy, relaxed, like he didn't have a care in the world. At 2 o'clock, the ceremony began. Aaliyah waited in her car, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She could hear the muffled sound of music coming from inside the church, could imagine everyone standing as the bride walked down the aisle. She thought about turning around and going home. She thought about calling the police and telling them what she was planning. But every time she considered backing out, she thought about that night on the kitchen floor, bleeding and losing her baby, and the anger came flooding back. At 2:15, Aaliyah got out of her car. She walked across the parking lot, her purse clutched tightly in her hand, and entered the church through a side door. The ceremony was in full swing. She could hear someone talking about love and commitment, could hear the rustle of people shifting in the pews. She walked quietly down the hallway until she reached a door that led into the main chapel. Through the small window, she could see the altar. Andre was standing there, holding Keisha's hands, smiling at her like she was his whole world, the same way he'd smiled at Aaliyah once upon a time. Aaliyah opened the door. The creak of the hinges caught a few people's attention, heads turning to see who was coming in late. She walked down the center aisle, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. More people turned to look. Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. Andre's smile faltered when he saw her. His face went pale. Recognition flickered in his eyes, followed quickly by something else. Fear, maybe, or anger. Keisha looked between them, confused, her smile fading. For a moment, everything was frozen, like the whole room was holding its breath. Then Aaliyah reached into her purse. Several people in the front rows saw the gun and started screaming. Andre took a step back, his hands coming up defensively. Keisha stumbled backward, nearly falling in her wedding dress. The groomsmen started moving toward Aaliyah, but they were too far away. And in that split second, Aaliyah looked Andre in the eyes and said 4 words. "This is for our baby." Then she pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space of the chapel. Screams erupted from every direction. People dove under pews. Parents covered their children. Someone yelled to call 911. Andre fell backward, clutching his shoulder, blood spreading across his white dress shirt. He wasn't dead. The bullet had hit him in the upper chest, missing any vital organs, but he was down and he was hurt. Keisha was screaming, dropping to her knees beside him, her wedding dress pooling around her in a cloud of white fabric now spattered with red. The groomsmen finally reached Aaliyah and tackled her to the ground. The gun skittered across the floor. Aaliyah didn't fight back. She just lay there, breathing hard, tears streaming down her face. Within minutes, the police arrived. They handcuffed Aaliyah and led her out of the church while paramedics rushed in to treat Andre. The scene outside was chaos. Wedding guests were spilling out of the building, some crying, some on their phones, some just standing there in shock trying to process what had just happened. News crews arrived shortly after, drawn by reports of an active shooter at a wedding. By that evening, the story was everywhere. Local news, national news, social media. Woman shoots ex-boyfriend at his wedding. Jilted lover opens fire in church. Bride's special day turns to tragedy. The initial coverage painted Aaliyah as a jealous ex who couldn't handle seeing Andre move on. Comment sections filled with people calling her crazy, evil, a monster. How could anyone do something like that? What kind of person ruins a wedding? She deserves life in prison. But then, slowly, more information started to come out. Renee went to the media with Aaliyah's story, with the hospital records from the miscarriage, with the police report about the stolen money, with photos of old bruises Aaliyah had shown her over the years. Aaliyah's therapist, with permission, spoke to reporters about the severe PTSD and depression Aaliyah had been dealing with since the abuse. And the note Aaliyah had left on her kitchen table was leaked to the press, detailing everything Andre had done to her in heartbreaking detail. Public opinion began to shift. Suddenly, the narrative wasn't so simple anymore. Hashtags started trending. Justice for Aaliyah. Believe survivors. How many red flags did we miss? People dug into Andre's past and found other women who came forward with similar stories of abuse, manipulation, and control. None of them had reported it to police, too afraid or too beaten down to seek help, but they were willing to speak up now. The district attorney's office charged Aaliyah with attempted murder, aggravated assault, and possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. If convicted on all counts, she was looking at 25 years to life in prison. Her public defender knew this case was going to be an uphill battle. The facts weren't in dispute. Aaliyah had walked into that church and shot Andre in front of hundreds of witnesses. There was no question of guilt in the traditional sense. The question was why, and whether that why mattered in the eyes of the law. The defense started building a case based on extreme emotional disturbance, a legal concept that acknowledges when someone commits a crime under the influence of psychological trauma so severe that it impairs their judgment. They brought in expert witnesses, psychologists who specialized in domestic violence and PTSD, who could testify about the long-term effects of the abuse Aaliyah had suffered. They talked about learned helplessness, about how years of trauma can fundamentally change the way a person's brain processes threats and makes decisions. They talked about trigger events and how seeing Andre about to marry someone else could have caused a severe psychological break. The prosecution argued that regardless of what Andre had done to Aaliyah in the past, her actions on June 15th were premeditated and inexcusable. She'd loaded a gun, driven to the church, and shot an unarmed man. That wasn't a psychological break, they argued. That was calculated revenge. They pointed out that Aaliyah had written a note before leaving her apartment, showing she'd thought through what she was about to do. They argued that if the court allowed past abuse to be an excuse for attempted murder, it would set a dangerous precedent. Victims would become vigilantes, they said, and the justice system would collapse into chaos. The case went to trial in November 2019, nearly 5 months after the shooting. The courtroom was packed every single day, split down the middle between people who saw Aaliyah as a victim who'd finally fought back and people who saw her as a dangerous criminal who'd nearly killed a man on what should have been the happiest day of his life. Andre testified, wheeled into the courtroom in a wheelchair for dramatic effect, even though he'd been cleared to walk weeks earlier. He told his version of events, admitting that yes, he and Aaliyah had dated, and yes, they'd had problems, but denying the severity of the abuse she described. He said she was exaggerating, that she'd always been unstable and prone to outbursts. He cried on the stand when asked about the shooting, saying he'd thought he was going to die, that he still had nightmares about it. Then it was Aaliyah's turn. She took the stand wearing a simple gray dress, her hair pulled back, looking small and fragile in the witness box. Her attorney walked her through her entire relationship with Andre, every detail, every incident. Aaliyah's voice shook as she talked about the night she lost her baby. Several jurors were visibly emotional. One wiped away tears. When her attorney asked her why she went to the church that day, Aaliyah paused for a long time before answering. She said she didn't know how to explain it in a way that would make sense to anyone who hadn't lived through what she'd lived through. She said that for 3 years she'd tried to move on, tried to heal, tried to be okay. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw Andre's face. Every time she heard a loud noise, she flinched. Every time she saw a pregnant woman, she thought about the baby she'd lost. And when she saw that he was getting married, that he was going to stand up in front of everyone and pretend to be a good man, something inside her broke. She said she wasn't making excuses for what she'd done. She knew it was wrong. She knew she'd hurt people, not just Andre, but Keisha and all the wedding guests who'd had to witness something so traumatic. But in that moment, standing in that church, all she could think about was making him feel a fraction of the pain he'd caused her. The prosecution's cross-examination was brutal. They asked Aaliyah why she didn't just call the police if Andre had really done all these terrible things. Why didn't she report the assault that caused her miscarriage? Why didn't she file charges when he stole her money? Why wait 3 years and then resort to violence? Aaliyah tried to explain that she'd tried to go through proper channels, that she'd filed reports that went nowhere, that the system hadn't protected her. But they kept pushing, kept making it sound like she was lying or exaggerating, kept painting her as a woman scorned who'd invented a history of abuse to justify attempted murder. By the time Aaliyah left the stand, she looked utterly defeated. The defense called several other witnesses, including Renee, who testified about the times she'd seen Aaliyah with bruises, and mental health experts who'd evaluated Aaliyah and diagnosed her with complex PTSD. They explained to the jury how trauma affects the brain, how someone with severe PTSD might have an impaired ability to assess situations rationally when confronted with their abuser. The prosecution countered with their own expert who argued that PTSD might explain emotional responses but doesn't explain deliberate actions like loading a gun and driving to a specific location. After 2 weeks of testimony, closing arguments, and jury deliberations, the verdict came back. The jury found Aaliyah guilty of aggravated assault and possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony, but not guilty of attempted murder. It was a compromise verdict, one that acknowledged she'd committed a serious crime, but also recognized the extraordinary circumstances that had led to it. When the sentence was read, 8 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 4, Aaliyah didn't react. She just nodded slowly, like she'd expected it. Renee broke down crying in the gallery. On the other side of the courtroom, Andre and Keisha sat stone-faced. The case sparked a national conversation about domestic violence, about how the system fails survivors, about what justice really means. Some people felt Aaliyah's sentence was too harsh, that she should have been given probation or mental health treatment instead of prison time. Others felt she'd gotten off too easy, that attempted murder was attempted murder, regardless of the backstory. Legal experts debated whether the extreme emotional disturbance defense should be expanded or whether it already went too far. Domestic violence advocates used the case to push for better resources for survivors, for more thorough police investigations. So where does that leave us? Nobody won here. Andre was shot and carries those scars. Keisha's wedding day became a nightmare she'll never forget. Hundreds of guests witnessed something they can never unsee. And Aaliyah sits in prison, paying for a decision made in seconds but built over years of suffering. The baby Aaliyah lost would be 7 years old now if Andre hadn't beaten her that night. That's a life that never got a chance, a future erased by violence. This case forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. At what point does a victim become a perpetrator? Where is the line between justice and revenge? If the system fails to protect someone, are they justified in protecting themselves even years after the fact? There are no easy answers. What happened in that church wasn't just about one woman and one man. It was about everything that led up to that moment. Every time someone should have helped but didn't. Every report that was filed and ignored. Every bruise that was explained away. Every cry for help that went unanswered. Think about this. If you were Aaliyah, if you'd lost a baby to violence, if you'd tried to get help and the system had failed you at every turn, and then you saw your abuser about to marry someone else, what would you have done? Would you have walked away? Or would you have felt that same desperate need for him to finally face consequences? Tell me your honest take in the comments. Do you believe Aaliyah's sentence was fair? Was there any other way this could have ended? And what needs to change in how we handle domestic violence so that people don't feel pushed to these extremes? Subscribe if you want more stories like this, stories that don't have easy answers. And if you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please reach out for help. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24/7. You don't have to suffer in silence. What happened to Aaliyah didn't have to end this way, and for the next person going through something similar, maybe it won't. but only if we start listening, believing survivors, and holding abusers accountable before it's too late.